Hello, everyone, and welcome to another interview on Tribunate. I'm here with Dr. Michael Kulikowski, and he is going to talk to us about this interesting period in Roman history between the Severans and Diocletian. As you know, on the channel right now, we've been focusing on what is broadly called the crisis of the 3rd century, and so I'm looking forward for him to kind of share some of his expertise and some of his knowledge in that area. So, Dr. Kulikowski, if you don't mind, can you tell the audience a bit about your background, a bit about your particular subject areas of research?
Hi, sure. I'm Michael Kulikowski. I teach at Penn State in the history department. I'm a Roman historian focusing on the later empire and the fall of the empire and the period that is immediately post-Roman, the post-Roman kingdoms of the West. I teach both Roman imperial history and ancient numismatics, history from coins. And I'm in the middle of working on a book on migration within the empire, into the empire, and the long scale of population movements in Roman history. My more recent books include a series of narratives that run from the time of the Emperor Hadrian to the Emperor Justinian, which are published by Harvard in this country, and are called The Triumph of Empire and The Tragedy of Empire.
Excellent. Yes. And so mostly today we're going to be talking about information that's covered in the first book, The Triumph of Empire. But I've read both. I thought they were both excellent, and I would love to have you back at a later date to kind of get into that messy 4th century post-Constantinian era, because that's super interesting, but unfortunately we just don't have time for all of that today. So as we, sit on the precipice of that crisis period of the 3rd century, do you mind providing just an overview of kind of where Rome is at the dawn of the Severan period, how it got there, and how it had kind of established itself as such a successful presence across the Mediterranean world during that, what's broadly called the period of the 5 good emperors? I'm doing air quotes that the viewers can't see. But what institutional reforms happened from the Principate of Augustus through to that period that allowed Rome to become so well established?
Well, I think the most important thing is not so much the continuation of imperial conquests, although there were further expansions of the empire after the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. But rather, I think it's the increasing professionalization of Roman government. The empire, as governed by Augustus and the members of his family, the Julio-Claudians, was really run as a combination of Roman Republican magistracies and a gigantic aristocratic household with the freedmen and the slaves and familial dependents doing a great deal of the work of empire. And when the dynastic change took place, and it was seen that you could have a Roman Empire without the Julio-Claudian family, this was a period in which the Roman imperial governing class is expanding, and the dynasties of the Flavians and then their successors, the Antonines, Hadrian and the Antonines, make more and more use of the second, if you will, the second rank, the second order in Roman society, the equestrian order. These are men of a certain property qualification who are eligible to become senators, but for the most part do not, and who increasingly fill the middle ranks of Roman governance, from the less important or the less militarized imperial provinces to all sorts of bureaus within the imperial government itself, from sort of the treasury to the chancelleries, and what you effectively have is a more professional, wouldn't go so far as to say centralized government, but a more professional government with a great deal more bureaucratic efficiency and a great deal more capacity to both monitor and sort of extract resources from the empire. And this corresponds to, changes in the center of gravity of the empire. I think the reign of Marcus Aurelius is very important in this respect, in the sense that one of the powerhouses of empire in the 3rd century that we'll be talking about is the Balkan Peninsula, Pannonia, or Illyricum, as it can be sometimes called. or the Danube region, if you will. And that the urban environment, the population growth in that area, the road network, just the overall development of the Pannonia and Illyricum, Balkans more generally, happens in the aftermath of Marcus Aurelius's wars on the Middle Danube, which we call the Marcomannic Wars. These are extremely consequential. I think it's safe to say. They reflect changes on the frontiers of the European frontiers of the Roman Empire that are, I think, a consequence of Rome's own success, which is to say the flourishing of Roman imperial provinces, the economic growth of, say, what's now France and Belgium and Germany, and the both on the inner side, the west and south side of the Rhine and Danube, and also over the Rhine-Danube salient. These have a profound sort of attractive impact on the hitherto rather small and disjointed tribal landscape of Central Europe, which leads to the growth of larger coalitions, including the Marcomanni and the Quadi, and friction between those emerging states, you might say, emerging barbarian states, and the Roman Empire itself.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating because, in my view, that's something that is kind of often elided over in popular retellings of this, this era of Roman history, is that there were these new pressures on the frontier and they were facing challenges for which, either the military ideology or the civic infrastructure was not particularly equipped to handle. Can you briefly give an overview of, I think the Goths are the most interesting of these emergent peoples. Can you give an overview of, in your opinion, who they are, where they come from, and how their sudden arrival on the Roman scene puts unforeseen pressures on Rome in this era?
Well, I can. It's not an uncontroversial topic, in part because
I'm not trying to trap you, I promise.
No, it's
I know that this is something where I could have you and I could have other experts on, and this could be 25 hours of content right here. But if you don't mind, I do find your perspective interesting, which is why I'm asking.
Absolutely.
And I thought that your particular theory of their emergence I found compelling. So
well,
if you don't mind
not
sharing that.
Not at all. I mean, the fact of the matter is that around the year 100, there is the historian Tacitus wrote an ethnographic work called the Germania. And roughly in what is now central Poland, he places otherwise not very notable a Germanic tribe called the Gutones there. Fine, okay. And then in the 6th century AD, a Latin speaker in Constantinople named Jordanes writes a history of the Goths, which talks about them migrating from Scandinavia to the southern shore of the Baltic, to the Black Sea, and then doing things like fighting Egyptian pharaohs and participating in biblical events, other ahistorical things, but places them in the north of the Black Sea and then on the Roman frontier on the lower Danube. Is there a mass migration that takes 600, 700, 800 years? No, I don't believe there is. Do people move all the time in antiquity? Yes, just as they do now. And where we first see something that we can call Goths, for sure, is in the region now basically between the Dnieper River in Ukraine and the Olt River in Moldavia and Romania and the lower Danube. This is where whatever relationship the people living in this area have to people named Gutones 300 years earlier, their political unit that we think of as the Goths comes into being in basically the steppe lands and the shores of the Black Sea in modern-day Ukraine and Moldova. This is where they are formed into a group that can be recognized both by themselves and then also by others as being Gothic in some sense. Culturally, obviously, they speak a philologically Germanic language. We know that because we have it. We have some examples of it, including a partial translation of the Bible. That tells you that they have a linguistic connection to the other Germanic-speaking people of Central Europe. Culturally, in the steppe, their material culture is a very strange, heterogeneous combination of northern artifact types, a certain number of burial types that look familiar from the north, but also a huge amount of influence from the Central Eurasian steppe. So you have what here looks like a society that comes into being locally under the leadership of people who become known as Goths. But what we have is an integration of local Sarmatians, of probably the remnants of the Greek polities along the north shore of the Black Sea, and quite a lot of steppes, residents of the steppe, sort of semi-nomadic pastoralists of the steppe. And you have a Gothic state that is capable of fielding fairly large armies, which start invading both by land and sea, raiding into the Roman Empire, beginning in the 250s. And doing what Rome's neighbors do throughout history, which is some of them provide mercenaries for the Roman state. In the famous inscription of the Persian Shah, Shapur, one of the nations that he conquers when he defeats the Roman army are Goths. So that tells you right there that there are Gothic units serving with the Roman army. But the fact of the matter is that this is a new state formation that takes place, and it does so in constant contact with the Roman Empire and with emerging technologies brought in from the Roman Empire.
Right. And I that's one of the things that I find so interesting about this era is that in some ways you could say that Rome of that high imperial period is a victim of its own success, and that it's forced its neighbors to evolve. And it's kind of, if you look at Persia, it pushed the Parthians to the brink, leading to the rise of the Sasanians, which, it's not parallel state formation in the exact same way that happened with the Goths, but it is kind of a tempering through conflict and, survival of the fittest, so to speak. And then, lo and behold, Rome now has enemies on the Rhine frontier, the Danube, and in the east that, it cannot deal with conflicts on all three fronts simultaneously, which sometimes it is being forced to reckon with. So given that view of what the external challenges are that are driving some of the decline and some of the instability, what, in your opinion, are the primary internal factors that meant that, they were smart, they were capable, they knew things, but in your opinion, what kept them from addressing these exactly head on and led to a succession of failed emperors, I would say up until maybe Decius, who perishes in battle with the Goths? There's a very rapid succession of emperors who reign for 1 to 2 years. What was the primary driver of that instability, in your opinion?
Oh, well, that's a very complicated question, of course. I think we have to understand that demographically, Rome had suffered very badly from the arrival of a plague, which is probably smallpox, in the reign of Marcus Aurelius. And we can see the impact of that just with the difficulty he has raising troops, and the fact that when he fights the Marcomannic Wars, which I mentioned earlier, he's not doing so with complete legions. He's doing so with units pulled together ad hoc from all over the place. That's significant of just demographic catastrophe in the 60s, 70s, 80s, based on plague. What this means is that it's safe to say that armies get smaller, armies get more difficult to raise, and it becomes more difficult to, I think, police the provinces in quite the same way as it could, as emperors could in the foregoing 100 years. The driving forces of the you mentioned the sort of heavy turnover of emperors. Driving forces there are somewhat different, and that's that after the last of the Severan dynasty dies out, and really during the reigns of the last two Severan emperors, Elagabalus and Severus Alexander, what you have is an inability to manage crises on multiple fronts at once, and the sort of a concomitant falling back by local populations on local solutions, or by regional armies, by commanders on a frontier where the emperor cannot be present, to create their own emperor and to deal with the problem. Because there's still this pervasive sense that in order to really cope with a challenge, it's not good enough to have a general. You have to have an emperor on the spot. And so there's this pressure that in the face of a Persian invasion, what do? Somebody becomes emperor to deal with it. And if there happens to be an emperor already, you can't coexist. There's a pressure this is the other dynamic, is that civil wars, usurpation, putting down a challenge to your own prospective dynasty always outclasses the whatever local problem you're dealing with, whatever barbarian invasion, whatever foreign war, anything else that you're dealing with. If there's a usurpation, that becomes the primary threat to the reigning emperor. And that leads to an endless series of civil wars, which of course then lead to further neglect of the Persian front, or it leads to more raiding in the Middle Danube or across the Rhine, and that in turn leads to another usurpation, and the cycle starts all over.
I think that's super interesting that you're right. We do see, in addition to this rapid succession of emperors, there are innumerable, failed usurpations by generals on the frontier. It seems like all it took was winning one victory for the legions to want to declare their commander the emperor. In your opinion, is that driven primarily by the fact that there is not a formalized institution of succession that, dating back to Vespasian, it kind of was, if you have the largest army and if you have troops ready, willing, and able to proclaim you emperor, you can march into Rome, the secret of empire, as Tacitus put it, and make yourself emperor?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important to realize that that there is no formal mechanism for succession in the Roman Empire. Why? Because the Roman Empire, it's an autocracy. It's not a monarchy. The Roman mythology, I mean, the founding mythology of Rome is throwing out the kings. There's a rex, king, is a dirty word in Latin. And so Augustus, although he established himself as an autocrat, with higher powers than all of the other magistrates, he presented himself as being just another magistrate with powers higher than other magistrates. And it was the granting of those powers, particularly the powers of a consul and the powers of a tribune, to his adoptive son Tiberius, that basically transmitted the autocracy for the very first time when Augustus died in AD 14. And it's that combination of powers which was then voted to Vespasian, as you mentioned, after the extinction of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, that determines who is legitimately emperor, is having these. And of course, emperors, when there's a son available, an adult male heir available, that's the person who everybody looks to. But again, it is not a formalized dynastic succession, which means that success in battle, generally, perhaps other types of successes, but dynastic connections can be trumped by successful command on the battlefield. And there is never a sense of absolute legitimacy that stops a commander in the field from being acclaimed imperator, emperor, by his troops, and then facing the question of, what do I do? Well, I've got to go and confront the reigning emperor on the battlefield, and then hope that I A, win, and that B, my legitimacy is then recognized at Rome by the Senate, by the people. I already have at least an army.
kind of piggybacking off of that, and this might seem like a little tangential, but one of the things that I find very interesting about this period is that as the power kind of shifts towards commanders, the capital, Rome, diminishes in its importance. You have emperors who spend the majority of their reign outside of Rome. You have some, like Maximinus Thrax, who never even enter the city during their time, holding the purple. In your opinion, how does this kind of diminution of Rome itself and the civic life of the city, the importance of, showing your face to the plebs, and those sort of factors, how does the diminution of that as part of the emperor's role and responsibility of the office kind of foreshadow the fact that, we're fragmenting a bit, and this can be a system where there are going to be multiple capitals and perhaps, even down the line, multiple emperors?
Complicated and gradual. The Rome retains a really important symbolic power even during this period of civil war and frequent usurpation. The first thing, most of the time, unless there's a pressing local crisis, most of the time you get proclaimed emperor, and the first thing you do is you start marching towards Italy to get to Rome, to be recognized there. And this happens repeatedly in the 200s, where particularly during the crisis provoked by the Goths in the Balkans, where one general after another either wins a victory somewhere in the Balkans along the Danube and gets proclaimed by his troops, turns around, starts marching for Italy, gets met by another emperor, another imperial claimant, and one of them dies on the battlefield, and it's the pull of Rome is still there. The legitimating pull of Rome is still there. That having been said, if you can make an emperor anywhere, and the world is now full of Roman citizens, you don't have non-Romans anymore inside the Roman emperor. So if everybody's a Roman, then you can be a Roman emperor. You can be not only made a Roman emperor somewhere else, but if the circumstances are right, you can continue to be a Roman emperor away from Rome. And of course, we see this beginning very starkly in the 260s, when you have a series of emperors in the Gallic provinces who make no effort whatsoever to cross the Alps and enter Italy and legitimate themselves there, but who also, the people have talked about it as a separate Gallic empire, Sonderreich in German. And the fact of the matter is that those emperors consider themselves to be the Roman emperor, despite the fact that they had no control over Italy.
I find that super interesting, and I find that that period where there is the breakup into the Gallic Empire, the Palmyrene Empire, and the central area of Italy. Gallienus is such a remarkable but such a tragic figure in my view. I feel like it really just goes all wrong for him, and he loses everything. Like, his father is captured, all of his sons are killed, and he sees what he, when he's assassinated, I feel like he's like, oh, and I've lost the entire empire doesn't exist either. Like, it just is such a tragic human story, in my opinion, him in particular. But as he is reigning, or, we don't even need to necessarily focus on him, but, as building off of, I would say that period from like Philip the Arab through to Gallienus, we have several emperors. Again, we get them. Valerian and Gallienus do manage to reign longer than their predecessors. But in your view, how does, the unique aspects of Roman ideology, kind of the inherent conservatism, the seeking out of a precedent for all actions, kind of constrain their ability to reform and meet the moment, so to speak?
I'm not sure if it's ideological. I mean, you're entirely correct about the conservatism of Roman ideology, and we can see it particularly in the attempt of Decius and Valerian and others of this period, in their coinage, in the symbolism, in the secular games that Philip stages for the millennium of Roman history. Millennium of the city of Rome, I should say. These are profoundly backward-looking gestures, trying to restore a vision of Rome as a successful empire, a successful people favored by the gods. This is why Decius demands universal sacrifice that leads to sort of tangentially and accidentally leads to the persecution of Christians. But the idea of universal sacrifice is a way of appeasing the gods. It's a way of making the empire safe in a period in which the empire has been demonstrably not safe, demonstrably losing battles in ways that are only partly conceivable. There is a lot of innovation. I mean, much of it is forced by circumstances, in the sense that it's just not possible to field the large stationary legions that you could do in the 2nd century. You've got the creation of a fundamentally mobile army made up of detachments pulled from wherever you can, and a mobile field army. This, for instance, is very much an innovation. It's an innovation that is forced upon a whole series of emperors by circumstance.
Right. I find Valerian's, that was actually the most recent video I did, was about Valerian's military innovations and how he did enact the cavalry to, have the mobile strike force to respond. And I find him a kind of just such a peculiar figure, because you're right, there is that backwards lookingness of, he does the formalized persecution, whereas, Decius was probably an accident, probably not trying to stamp out the Christian religion, but Valerian, there's no ambiguity there. He even writes the second rescript to say, like, no, this is what I want, when people are surprised that at the implications of what he had said. So how that they've grown in their ability to respond militarily in these ways. Is there a similar trajectory of political evolution to kind of change how the emperor operates and the position of I do want to talk about equestrianization more broadly as well, but are there political changes that mirror these military innovations? And in your view, are they rapid enough? Are they well thought out enough to address the challenges that Rome is facing?
Well, I'm not sure that much of this is thought out, to be honest. I think that certainly in the reign of Severus and his successors, there is a very serious legal juristic attempt by Roman lawyers to understand what it means to have the entire population of the empire be Romans, and to really, if you will, systematize how lawyers, and therefore often government officials, thought about what it meant to be Roman, and what that meant in terms of rights, what that meant in terms of responsibilities, what that meant in terms of what you could or could not legally do. In that period, at the same time, the acknowledgement of the authority of the emperor being absolute, and basically being above many laws and making the laws. This is something that sort of does take the Roman state away from the fiction of the Augustan period, of the Julio-Claudian period, in which the emperor is merely the first citizen, ruling along with the governing senatorial class. What you have now is very clearly an acknowledgement of autocracy. It's not an acknowledgement of hereditary monarchy, right? That never happens. But what does happen is the sense that you have an emperor from whom the laws follow, from whom the law flows, and from who really is at the center of a state that he can command, or ought to be able to command. And this, I think, does tie into the question you asked about equestrianization, the fact that you have bureaucrats tend to think in orderly fashion, and the more that you're able to impose order on things, the more likely you are to want to impose further order on things. And I think that's what we see throughout the 2nd century, and I think we see it in the 3rd century, and again with things like Decius's sacrifice order. 200 years earlier, it really wouldn't have occurred to anybody that every person alive in the Roman world should be forced to do the same thing. That would have been inconceivable, because it was a world made up of many different peoples that just happened to be tributary to Rome, subject to Rome. Under the Severans and the post-Severian period, the idea that you could, in fact, impose a singular order on the Roman citizen body, on the whole population of the empire, of course, you can't make that reality, but it can be conceived of. And this is something that's quite new. And it feeds into the Restoration. It feeds into one of the ways in which the 4th century empire is really fundamentally different from the 1st and 2nd century empire.
I think that's fascinating because there's this trend towards broader unity within the society in the sense of conceptually at least, at a time when to an outsider from our vantage point of history, it looks as though the society is becoming more fragmented and becoming more disorderly. And I think that does bring up the point of, this so-called crisis of the 3rd century is not evenly distributed, shall we say. There is even boom times, so to speak, in some areas of the empire. Africa is largely untouched. There are some areas that are doing well. In what ways is that perception of kind of like an omni-crisis where everything is on fire all the time kind of a misperception in your view?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very bad time to live in the Balkans, put it that way. You don't, and parts of Gaul are repeatedly devastated. But again, Rome's geography is focused out on its frontiers, and if you're not in an area that is repeatedly being fought over, then there's a great deal of prosperity exists in the 3rd century. Most people, I think, probably most of the time experienced life as being what it had always had been, which is an agricultural life with very little impact or even evidence of this crisis. There's, but it's worth recognizing that a normal life for a Roman meant being likely to die likely to die young, likely to experience really quite horrible disease, and likely to live on on the edge of subsistence quite a lot of the time. So the part of the reason that we perceive crisis is that we're looking at the uppermost tranche of Roman society, and we're looking particularly at the politically active proportion of that society and the military. And that's where the crisis takes place. The crisis takes place in the ruling elites for the most part. The local elites, if you will, the regional leaders, only a tiny number of whom enter imperial history in a way that you can even see in our sources. Those people are living, if anything, better. This is a period in which you see the villa culture of Britain, the villa culture of parts of Spain, just exploding in terms of its opulence and the ability of these local or regional elites to pull resources from the land and invest them in really sort of urban, but also especially in Spain and in Britain, rural display in villas, in luxurious, country retreats, if you will, and that continues despite the fact that in parts of northern Gaul or in the Danube, the lands are being fought over every single year in and year out.
Could you speak a little bit about that kind of core of local elites, because that's they're kind of, as you said, the glue that holds the empire together. And I think a different way of viewing this 3rd century crisis period can be to talk about, wow, this is actually a very resilient society to sustain, blow after blow and such high imperial turnover. And for everyone at the end of the day to still come out saying, well, we're Roman and we're putting the pieces back together instead of, there is some fragmentation, obviously, with the Gallic and Palmyrene empires, but by and large, it's a story of this society kind of weathering these haymaker punches. And I think a lot of that can be attributed to the success during that high imperial period of integrating those local elites into the broader imperial project, making them satisfied with, rule from Rome, for lack of a better term. But how does that civic glue of not cities like Alexandria or Antioch, but the smaller cities of maybe 25, 30,000 people that are peppered throughout the empire. How does that remain stable and unite the Roman project?
Well, I think partly it's the visible public monuments, the sense of the sense of everything somehow being under the protection of a Roman emperor. I think, as importantly, it's the legitimation that local elites get locally from being the people, the interlocutors with the central government, right? The fact that you're the person who speaks, or you're the group of people who speak for your community, and it's through you that the larger mass of the population is connected to something higher and connected to the gods, right? Let us not forget that there's a religious and if you will, sort of psychological affinity between the larger imperial project and provincial Romans. But I think that the local elites, again, it's a center seeking kind of environment in which one's sense of identity is legitimated in a series of stages that lead eventually to an imperial center. And I think that the idea of identifying with an imperial center and the lack of any obvious alternative, right, is actually very significant. And the fact that the imperial center keeps pulling back into view repeatedly, even when it's challenged, even when an emperor is challenged, there is a sense that, I mean, it's what I said at the start of our conversation here, that if there's a problem, a really big problem, what you need to fix it is an emperor. You need an emperor to fix it. And so this is a very powerful sort of unifying force.
Excellent. And so, speaking of you need an emperor to fix it, are there any of the figures of these kind of like short-lived emperors or the Barracks emperors who you identify as somebody who, man, he really could have done better. He could have turned things around if one or two things had gone differently. Are there any kind of like tragic figures that in your reading you're like, I kind of like him and I was kind of rooting for him. Unfortunately, he reigned for 18 months before he died. Are there any figures that jump off the page to you in particular?
I mean, honestly, from the period of Philip the Arab onwards, you're dealing with, or possibly Maximinus, you're dealing with a bunch of people who are fundamentally pretty hard-headed, brutal thugs for the most part. So I don't, our sources are very limited. There's not a lot of, it's hard to feel any personality coming off most of these emperors because we just don't have the evidence for it. I mean, Tacitus lets you get, sort of think your way into the mind of Tiberius and all of the horrors of that. But you can't really do that with somebody like Philip or Gallienus or Aurelian. I mean, Aurelian, clearly is a very, very successful, hard-headed, bloody-minded soldier who has no qualms whatsoever of massacring citizens. I mean, he's like Severus, if he's quite willing to disband or kill off the Praetorian Guard if they are, if they're rebellious. And he gets assassinated for it, clearly, for the harshness of it. The figure I wish we knew more about is the Emperor Probus, who reigned for 6 years, and before he succumbed to assassination in a period in which every emperor is assassinated at some point or another. And I'm not quite sure. The sources are so poor, we really don't know how Probus did it, but he did. And he to reign for 6 years and campaign in every season of those 6 years, and not face. I mean, just to hang on. I mean, that right there, I'd love to know how he did it.
You're right, because that in and of itself proved too difficult for many, right?
Most of them.
Just simply, having the job from one day to the next was, that took up 99% of their mental energy, it seems like. But as we talk about kind of maybe people like Probus or people like Aurelian who made strides and kind of moved the project forward, or at least halted, the decline, I want to ask if, Diocletian and Constantine in particular get a lot of the credit for kind of arriving at these solutions through either their own enigmatic genius, force of personality, or, in the case of Constantine, people would call it like divine fortune even. But, this is kind of in my opinion, a very simplified narrative that leans too heavily into this like great man theory of history where they want to cast Diocletian and Constantine as figures occupying the same space as Julius Caesar, Augustus, Trajan. In your opinion, how do these small like micro innovations that we see from figures like Valerian, Gallienus, Aurelian kind of set the tone for allowing Diocletian and Constantine the flexibility they need to embark on more full-ranging reforms that do kind of see Rome through this period of crisis?
Multiple different answers to that. I think one of the most important things is that happens in the course of the 3rd century, and again, it's because they have no choice, is recognizing that ad hoc measures and that mobility is more important than, both in governance and in finance and in military affairs. You've got to have considerably more flexibility and also more eyes on the ground, if you will, and more ability to monitor the situation. And I think that the realism with which Aurelian recognizes that the salient of Dacia up through the Carpathians is in fact not sustainable. That's the sort of choice that is it is a precedent for the more systematizing effects or systematizing efforts that Diocletian makes. I think that it's important to realize, because you're quite right that there's a tendency to really valorize Diocletian and his genius. It's worth remembering that for the first 10 years of his reign, his joint reign with Maximian, it looks very, very much like everything that had gone before, right? The failed attempts at coinage reform, repeated rebellions, repeated campaigns on every single Roman frontier, including North Africa, which was largely peaceful earlier in the 3rd century. It's only in the 290s when Diocletian conceives of creating the Tetrarchy and creating 2 junior emperors to help things out that I think the vision of how to really get past crisis is firmly locked in. And I think the fundamental difference between the pre-Diocletianic and the post-Diocletianic period is the single most important reform is separating military from civilian governance in the provinces. Because what it means now, it used to be the case, that the person who governed the province commanded the army and paid the army. After Diocletian, the people who pay the army are not the same people who lead the troops in battle. And that is fundamentally cuts the legs out from underneath the capacity for a usurpation to really get going quickly. You can still have usurpations, but it requires considerably more coordination from a much smaller baseline resource base.
So, in your opinion, that move to, carve the provinces up into smaller and smaller municipalities, so to speak, as well as to sever the bonds between the military and the civil administration of troop command, is that more critical than the tetrarchy, than the saying, hey, here's the clear line of succession, here's the division of responsibilities? Because I think in the popular history retelling, the tetrarchy is what, if you know one thing about Diocletian, it's the tetrarchy. And I think that's because that's so easy to communicate, and you can put a map up that shows here it is divided into quarters, right? So, but then clearly the tetrarchy falls apart very quickly, but Rome, does not fall back into crisis. There are civil wars, of course, but it is not the sustained rolling crisis. So, in your estimation, it's that division of how the troops are administered and commanded that is the primary takeaway from Diocletian?
Yeah, Diocletian's succession plans, are conceptually gorgeous and a great idea that fails instantaneously upon Diocletian and Maximian's retirement, in part because Maximian has no desire whatsoever to retire. This is the case, and because Maximian and Constantius have adult sons who are never going to put up with being excluded from the succession. So that's a total failure at every level. But beneath that, you have a sort of ruling elite of both, great senators and commanders, but also lower ranks of administrators put in place at a much more local level that is, but also, unlike in the early empire, is not mediated through purely through the cities and through the countryside and through the landowners. You have actual imperial officials who are doing the tax collecting, who are doing the census taking, who are making sure that enough of tax A comes from region B to pay for whatever the expenses need to be paid for. And that infrastructure is in place by the time the Tetrarchy starts to fall apart, and the 10 years of messing about after Diocletian's retirement don't disturb the functioning of this governmental bureaucracy that he's put in place. And I think that's absolutely fundamental to overall stability, is because you've got people, and this is the 4th century, you've got people whose status depends upon there being a functioning Roman state, whose own power, whose own authority, whose own income depends upon the state functioning. And it doesn't matter to them necessarily who the emperor is, but there sure has to be an emperor, because that's where their own livelihood derives from.
Right. And I think this is very critical, because one of the things you said in your book, and I don't want to quote it back to you because I think I'll mess it up, but when you were talking about how conceivably during the 3rd century there could be, we're going to reinstitute the Empire of Hadrian. That was, if a distant hope, that is a conceptual idea that would have been intelligible and would have been aspirational. But then after Diocletian, would you say that the state of the state has changed to such a degree that empire of the high imperial period of Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius is no longer seen as like the aspiration, the golden rule, that they're recognizing that they're living in something different?
Tough question. I think this, I think that Trajan, for instance, remains one of the emperors upon whom you modeled yourself right to the end of the empire. Sure. Do people realize they're living in a very, in a different world from that of the High Empire? It's very hard to say, because we don't have the evidence for it. I mean, certainly the 4th century historians knew that there had been a crisis in the 3rd century. That's no question, that both in Greek and in Latin historical literature, there was clearly a sense of a real hiatus between the era of Marcus and the era of Constantine. Was there an aspiration to go back to this golden age? I'm not sure people really knew what that would even mean, what that would have meant, because the world in which they grew up was so fundamentally structured, so fundamentally differently from the high imperial period, in the sense that there's just so much more imperial authority as opposed to regional authority connecting upwards towards the emperor, right? You have the late empire. It looks much more like a state than the early empire looks like. I mean, I think that's the fundamental difference, and I'm not sure that people realized it, but there certainly is no way they could have gone back to governing an empire in the way that the Antonines did, or still less the Julio-Claudians.
I think that's very well put, and I think it also it kind of drives home that the Roman state evolved constantly, as any state does. Like, it's easy for us to segment it into, the early monarchy, the republic, principate, and then the later, late antiquity period. But in reality, there's constant ebbs and flows. It's a living, organic structure because its borders are changing, its population is changing. So naturally, the forms that it take has to change. And I think that, the people who kind of valorize Rome tend to view it as static. I feel like that was one of the things that you expressed really well in your books, The Tragedy of Empire and The Triumph of Empire, is that the Roman state is going to evolve, it is going to change, and that we kind of looking backwards and expecting it to fall into like neat periods is kind of anachronistic on our part as moderns, viewing it from 2,000 years distance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to remember, right, that 20 years, 50 years, 100 years took as long to live then as it does now. And if you're looking back, it's easy to sort of elide or compress, our mental maps of time, shrink more distant time into smaller sort of conceptual units than when we think of our own lives in their decades, which can feel like they take forever to live. I mean, it's so I think it's really important to remember that the experience of Romans was no different from ours, of that 10 years take 10 years to live, full stop. States evolve, people move, borders change, tactics change, technologies change. I mean, there is still a Roman state in one form or another down to 1453 when the Ottoman Turks capture Constantinople finally, and I have colleagues who will assert to you that this is fundamentally internally still a Roman Empire in its own self-conception. Okay, yeah, I mean, I'm willing to. I think that one can acknowledge that. I think that the important thing to realize is that breaking things down into discrete historical periods, which we kind of try to make as much alike as they are internally, is a conceptual convenience for ourselves. It's not a reflection of the fact that history is constantly in motion, right? And that yes, after 200 years pass, you're going to find a very different Rome than you found 100 years earlier, and that's just necessarily the way time works. It's the way history works.
Great. And honestly, that's a good trailer for, I would love to have you back to talk about the wider breadth of Roman history, because as you've said, I don't know if I can't go all the way to 1453, but, there is the 4th century, there is the Constantinian period, and that period of kind of decline in the West to go into. So, if you've got time, I would love to have you back on the show later to talk about that era of history. And we didn't even get to talk as much about the Goths as I wanted to as well. There's just so much to get into, but that's the fun part of history, is I feel like the more you read, the more questions you get, and the more doors are open to talk to exciting people who are at the forefront of the field. So as we wrap up, I wanted to ask really quickly, are there any projects that you're working on that you'd like to get the word out on? Are you on social media? Is there anywhere that people who are wanting to know more about you or your work can follow you?
Right. I'm not on social media, I have to say. I am working.
That's smart.
I like to think so, yeah. But thanks for the kind words. I'd be happy to come back and talk some more. I am working on something that should be out probably within the year for Yale University Press, a book on population dynamics, population movement and migration in the Roman Empire. And I think that's something that I'm hoping will appeal to a very broad audience of listeners who are interested in historical change and who might want to get an appreciation of how fluid ancient societies really could be in terms of who belonged and who was, who did not belong in a particular time period. I think that's coming forward. In terms of following my work, I write for the London Review of Books very often, a couple of times a year usually, and so you can follow my work there for a broad audience. And I should say that I also write on popular music history, and I would love for I'd love for people to discover a little book on Roxy music that I wrote called Roxy Music on Track. So if people want to check out an entirely different aspect of my research, that's the place to look. Thanks very much.
All right, cool. Well, hey, we all contain multitudes, and it's cool that, I like music myself, and maybe that's what we talk about next time. Who knows? But Michael Kulikowski, thank you so much for your time. It was a real pleasure talking to you. And links to his books will be in the description if you're interested in learning more about this unique period of Roman history. Some of the things we talked about, some of the things we didn't. If you want to get ahead of the curve, I'll put the links down below. Thank you so much. Bye.